And welcome back, fellow football fanatics. This is College Football with Sam coming at you with our first of a multi-part series in our Week 10 previews. In part 1 of the Week 10 previews, we will be paying close attention, to Vanderbilt versus Texas, Penn State versus Ohio State, Miami versus SMU. That's going to be the noon window where we will start. We'll then go clockwise, following the paths of time, to Indiana versus Maryland. And then we'll check out some exciting night games in Oklahoma versus Tennessee and USC versus Nebraska. USC versus Nebraska is the game out of all of those that I am the most excited for, and I cannot wait to see what those games provide. I mean, we are blessed every Saturday with college football. We even have Memphis playing Rice this Friday. And I think the only power game played this Friday, North Carolina versus Syracuse. That's it. Over the next few weeks, there will be some higher quality power football games on Friday night. So, of course, you have the Heroes game on the Thanksgiving weekend. I think next week you have Minnesota traveling to Oregon, which, Oregon should win that game pretty decisively, but you never know. So that's very exciting. For some reason, my face is all itchy. I don't know why that happens only when I'm going live. Maybe it's nerves. I don't know exactly what it is, but we have a lot of games to get to today. So make sure that you are subscribed, that you have hit the notification bell, that you are active in the live chat. We will answer super chats, all of them, in between the segments. If you do have something that's interesting, regardless of whether it's a super chat or not, just make sure to send it in because I may or may not get to it. But do all those things. Thank you for helping us get 27,000 subscribers. The goal is within these next few weeks for us to cross 30,000. And if we can miraculously blow up before the season ends, that would also be phenomenal. So do all of those things. And without further ado, I want to start off with a few things that wrap up week 9. We'll get to, on a later stream, some coaching carousel stuff. So candidates for the Florida coaching job, for the LSU job that just opened last night. And also want to get to some Michigan State coaching carousel stuff, because I don't know if Jonathan Smith will be fired this year. I have an inkling that he will be, and Michigan State's a pretty good job, so I want some candidates. I want to talk about some candidates for that position. Same thing with Wisconsin, but I don't have any plans to do that this week. I might do that Wednesday, but we'll just have to see. I want to get to my reaction to the Week 10 AP poll, which released yesterday at 2 p.m. I want to discuss my most overrated and underrated teams in this poll. The top 10 of the AP poll remains mostly unchanged. Ohio State's at 1, Indiana's at 2, Texas A&M is at 3. Top 3 remains unchanged. Same thing with Alabama at 4, UGA, Georgia at 5. We have Oregon at 6th, Mississippi at 7th, Georgia Tech at 8th. Vanderbilt jumps up to 9th. This is their, highest ranking in the 21st century easily. Is it their highest ranking ever? Someone let me know down in the comment section below. And Miami and BYU are tied at 10th. So that is your top 10. Let's take a deeper look at the top 25. The AP poll top 25, and talk about some teams that I think are underrated, overrated, and also overlay what I think the top 10, top 25 power ratings are, and compare and contrast them with what the AP poll is, which is more of a poor attempt at judging the resumes of college football teams. I say a very poor attempt because let's just get the bad and the ugly out of the way and get to the good later. Virginia at 15th is an atrocity. Why is Virginia there? They had 2 defensive scores against Louisville to beat them in overtime. Virginia beat a Florida State team who at the time was ranked inside the top 10, and that is why they're ranked at 15th. But that Florida State team is now 3-4, and I don't even know if they're going to beat Wake Forest this Saturday. The Cavaliers are gutsy. They have an underrated quarterback in Chandler Morris. I believe that Tony Elliott has done a good job, but what merit do they have to be ranked 15th in a strength of record based poll? The top three are pretty correct. I think that Ohio State, Indiana, and A&M, you look at ESPN's SOR, you look at other websites' strength of record, those are really your top three. ESPN's SOR has A&M first, Indiana second, and Ohio State third. If you're purely going off of strength of record, I think that would be correct of the top three, or you could have Indiana at first. I think if you're comparing all undefeated resumes from those three teams, Ohio State would probably have the weakest argument to be first. But the reason they're first, and very understandably so, is they're the defending national champs. They started out the year ranked ahead of Indiana and A&M. So going off of trends and past history, you would rank them one. And they're power rated ahead of Indiana and A&M and favored to win the national title ahead of both of those. So I don't have a problem with the top three at all. If you were to change around any of those teams, as long as all of them are your unanimous top three, I would not have a problem with that whatsoever. Alabama and Georgia, top five. Oregon at sixth. Love that. Ole Miss at seventh. From a strength of record standpoint, I think they're properly rated. I will say that I still don't think they're a top 10 rated team, though they're very close. I think they are, in many ways, the inverse of last year's team, where last year's team was super talented, but not exactly well managed, while this year's team isn't extremely talented. They're not national title caliber talented as last year's team was, but they are much better managed. But I think Kiffin has done a very good job with the Rebels season this year. They're firmly in the playoff conversation. Georgia Tech at 8th, 8-0. They've won all of their games. Key's doing a really good job. Their strength of schedule, much like Virginia's, is very weak, so they are probably overvalued here, but I love their story. We were high on them preseason, picked them to win 10 games, and it looks like they're going to overshoot that. Love Vanderbilt 9th, Miami top 10. BYU also tied for 10th. This is a team that from a strength of record standpoint could be lower, but also could be accurately ranked. I will say from a ratings angle, BYU is not a top 10 team. They're not even top 15. BYU is a team that is well coached. They know how to win close games. Their defense comes up clutch when necessary. They have a very good, solid, fundamental offense. Love to run the ball and physically pound their opponents, but they are not a national title contender. Notre Dame behind BYU, 5-2. I understand the placement there. They are much more of a national title contender than a lot of teams ahead of them on the list. At 5-2, you could argue they should be lower because they do have two losses. One to A&M, the other to a Miami team who's looked a little sloppier in the month of October, which is coming to a close. The rest of these rankings, I think, are pretty subjective. I think Iowa should be in the top 25. They're one of the more underrated teams. They are a better team than Memphis. They're better than Houston. They have shown me more than Texas has. They've shown me more than Missouri has. They're better than Cincinnati. They're better than Louisville. Iowa should be up here. It's kind of a travesty that they aren't. Washington should be on here instead of Memphis. They just crushed Illinois, who was previously ranked 23rd. Washington should be up here. I think that those are your more underrated teams that were left off the list, Iowa and Washington. There is an argument that based on Houston only losing to Texas Tech and beating everyone else, that if you're going to put Cincinnati at 17th, maybe Houston should be higher, but power ratings would disagree with that. Ultimately, we're so late in the season, so close to the college football playoff rankings, the first of which come out next week, that I'm pretty indifferent to this. if I'm being honest. There isn't much else to say. There are some underrated teams. There are some overrated teams. What sucks about the AP polls, as much as we want to pretend that it doesn't affect the view of the College Football Playoff Committee, it does. I mean, Virginia will be ranked in those initial ballots pretty highly, even though they should be ranked at best probably in the 20s, for example. They're winning a bunch of close games. They would never compete in the college football playoff if they went there. It's very similar with a lot of these teams that are ranked currently. And then you have Iowa and Washington left off, and they would do a much better job in the playoff than a Virginia, than a Houston, than a Memphis, for example. I'm not one who says we should just let the sports books or FPI decide who gets in the playoffs. That's a bit ridiculous. But I also am not one that's going to let you are what your record says you are taint the rankings or the ratings. I don't want that either. And the AP poll certainly tends to the latter rather than to the former. Texas at 20th, a lot of that is name. And people thinking that since they're top 15 or top 10 in power ratings that they should be ranked. If you're going off of strength of record, barely beating Kentucky, Mississippi State losing to a Florida team that will finish with a losing record, and also losing to Ohio State. I mean, that was a good loss in hindsight, but the only good win they have is an Oklahoma team who just lost to Ole Miss at home and lost to Texas, and their best win of the year is a Michigan team at home who was a lot worse back then than they are now. So some questionable things there, but it's outside of my control. It ultimately is what it is. That's my reaction to the Week 10 AP poll top 25. I would expect parts of this list to look a whole lot different after November is done. November is the month where the real teams, where the contenders and the pretenders are sorted and separated out. I will say, though, I don't think that top four is changing at the end of November. Could be wrong. Probably will be now that I just said that. There's always chaos that can happen, especially when the sport has more parity now than ever before. But I love Ohio State, Indiana, Alabama, and A&M as all top 5 teams in America. Those are the best teams in America right now, I would say. Those 4 plus another that we will talk about right now. I want to give you my top 10 power ratings for Week 10. After Week 9's results, there have been some shifts in my top 10, and this top 10, the criteria is mostly based on the eye test, power ratings that I see and read and scrape and sift through, and a little bit of strength of schedule and strength of record baked in, of course, because if you look wonderful on the eye test, but you haven't played anybody, someone who doesn't look as good on the eye test but has played a much tougher strength of schedule probably will look better on the eye test than the team who is just blowing through their schedule that's as strong as a pile of leaves, if that team that has the tougher schedule had to play the weaker one. They'd look better than the team that has to play the weaker one. Hopefully that makes sense. I think that is pretty clear. So let's start off with number 10, that being Miami. Miami is an interesting case study for me because they have looked sloppier on offense as time has gone on. I love their offensive line. I think Carson Beck, when he is good, is great. When he is bad, he's terrible. And their wide receiver core isn't as good as it was last year. There is a noticeable drop-off from last season's Miami offense to this one, and a noticeable difference in style of play. The defense is dramatically improved. I believe this Miami team is better than last year's Miami team. Not by a ton, but by a little, sure. The Stanford game did not encourage me. They kind of ran up the score late after physically pounding Stanford. It was not an encouraging game. And Louisville's a good team, but Louisville is not they're a team that won't win more than one game at best in the college football playoff, depending on their seeding and the side of the bracket they're put on and the games that they have to play, the series of games. So that was not a good loss for Miami. They only lost by 3 despite the massive turnover differential that was in Louisville's favor. So They're one of the best teams in America. They have a higher ceiling than what they're showing right now, but their floor is also lower. And games at SMU and at Pittsburgh are going to be tough. They cannot afford to lose another game, and they keep dropping in my ratings. Number 9 is Texas Tech at 7-1. They destroy the bad teams and the mediocre teams regardless of who starts at quarterback, whether it is Brycen Moore, Will Hammond, who's going to miss the rest of the season, or Mitch Griffiths, who transferred in from Wake Forest after starting there, I think, a year or maybe 2. Doesn't matter. They just murder their opponents left and right. The bad ones, the mediocre ones. Arizona State is a good team that I know they just lost to Houston, but Houston's well coached. They have some players too. So I think they're the class of the Big 12. I still, as of right now, would favor them to win the Big 12, but it all depends on a variety of things. Arizona State is probably eliminated from that picture with the loss to Houston, so you don't have to worry about that tiebreaker, but BYU's undefeated. They're coming to your place in a bit. You have to beat them. And Cincinnati, they're also undefeated. Utah has 2 losses, but with how their schedule works out, they're the 2-loss team with the best chance of getting in because their combined opponent wins and losses in Big 12 play, the win percentage of that is just so high, and that's a tiebreaker. So they have to figure out offense. They have to figure out quarterback. They have to get healthy there. But that defense, it's up there with Indiana and Ohio State's, which those are the top 3 defenses right now in America per ESPN's efficiency. That D-line with David Bailey, with Lee Hunter, with Romello Height, with Rodriguez behind them at linebacker, that is an electric defense that will keep them in every game, and it will help them blow out opponents that they are able to get on top of if their offense is correctly in place and in sync. Number 8's USC. I don't exactly know how to feel about this one. I am of the opinion that USC, when healthy, is a top 10 team. The power ratings reflect that. The adjusted EPA per play affects that, or shows that, but also affects my opinion. At the same time, however, they do not have the depth that any team on this list does. Texas Tech is deeper. Miami is deeper. Everyone ahead of USC is deeper. Their starters, especially on offense, are phenomenal. And they have some phenomenal starters on defense too. And I do think Lincoln Riley, when he's not overthinking things, is a impressive coach. They could win out. We'll see what they do against Nebraska this Saturday. And they have a trip to Oregon later in the year. Before that, they have to host Iowa at home. That is going to be a tough stretch. They can get through it unscathed, though. And because they simply have the potential to do that, I think they are deserving of a top 10 rating. If you disagree with that, totally fine, but I'm putting them up here. Number 7's Notre Dame. Notre Dame with 2 losses. Well, it's the same with USC. They beat USC head-to-head, and neutral field would have beaten them as well. So I have them ahead of the Trojans, have them ahead of the Hurricanes, who beat them, but that was early in the year with a lot of travel that Notre Dame had to do to get down to Miami, and a climate change that affected them in a negative way. And you saw that as the game went on. Notre Dame is physical. They are quick at running back. They're quick on offense, really. The only thing that prevents me from rating them higher is defensively, I still do not trust them. I know that some people disagree, and they showed some improvements against USC. But keep in mind, USC had to travel across America. Notre Dame was up for that game, and USC was down their starting center and their top 2 running backs. I underestimated how much of an effect that could have on the USC run game. Notre Dame's pass defense will not survive in the playoffs against your top contenders. So Indiana, especially Ohio State, Oregon with Evan Stewart back, Alabama with those receivers, they would, I think, reliably tear up that secondary. And most of those teams have enough on defense, even Alabama, because Notre Dame's quarterback isn't all that mobile, to limit what Notre Dame wants to do offensively. So I think Notre Dame is one of the best teams in America. They could be a title contender. I think they're close. They're in that next tier below my top 3, top 4 that I think are your obvious title contenders. Well, really top 5 or even top 6. But there are some things they need to work on. 6th, speaking of which, is Georgia. Georgia stands at 6-1. Love what they do on offense. Defensively, they're just a mess overall. They are incapable of getting a pass rush. They struggle in coverage. This is Kirby Smart's worst defense since his 2016 team, his first year at Georgia. This is also a much improved Georgia offense from where it was last year. Gunnar Stockton is, I think, 2nd in America in QBR. His receivers, Zachariah Branch, Dylan Bell, they have upgraded. London Humphreys is involved. Their tight ends are better. Their running back room is deeper and better. Their offensive line, led by center Drew Bobo, has been impressive this year. More consistent, more cohesive than last year's unit. Much like Notre Dame, if they can figure out defense, they will be in that next tier. But we've seen 7 games of both of those teams, and while Notre Dame's made strides and Georgia's had some games where in the second half they're locked down, they have nowhere near the defense that all the teams in front of them, outside of maybe one of them, and that's A&M, do. But A&M, they're undefeated. They beat Notre Dame on the road when Notre Dame came off of a bye, and if not for a blocked punt, which was probably the most flukish play of the game, A&M may have won that game by 2 possessions. I don't know. Very back and forth. A&M won the coaching battle. They won the plays, the plays that could have gone either way. That's including the blocked punt, too, that went against them. And look what they did to LSU. I know LSU's offense doesn't have a whole lot of juice to it, but they abused that LSU defense. And if not for 2 turnovers, instead of the final score being 49-25, maybe it could have been 56-18 or 56-16 if not for that safety. A&M made plenty of mistakes in that first half, and they still pulled away, and they got Brian Kelly fired. This is one of the best teams in America. They could be the best team in the SEC. I have people in my corner that I trust who view this team as equal with Alabama and Ohio State as teams that can win the title, or even Indiana, as Indiana's really jumped up in power ratings in the month of October, and even this past week because they had an impressive performance. I love Colin Klein, Mike Elko, Marcel Reed's taken a step forward in his game. Cassius Howell has 10 sacks this season. This unit's dangerous. There's a really good chance that they could be one of those teams, along with likely Indiana and Ohio State, that could finish the regular season undefeated. Number 4 is Oregon. Oregon, it's difficult. They are no longer in my unanimous tier 1 of teams that I am confident can win it all. They were last week, along with Alabama, Indiana, and Ohio State. They've dropped a little bit. So instead of being in tier 1, they're in tier 1B, where I would put A&M as well. And then those other 3 teams that we'll talk about in a few seconds, that's tier 1A. Oregon has issues in pass offense. They do not have the proper amount of weapons to make a young quarterback's life easy. And their offensive line, I think, along with Arkansas and Cincy, is the best in run blocking. They have some issues in pass blocking. Not a lot, and I'm nitpicking there, but the tiny issue that O-line has in pass blocking compounds, I think, some of Dante Moore's weaknesses. Doesn't help. Oregon's defense is way ahead of where it was last year, especially at secondary. They could have the best secondary in America, up there with Alabama and Ohio State for sure. You also have a rushing offense with very young backs, great tight ends, a big offensive line, and also a big defensive line, to where their trench play is up there as, I think, possibly the nation's best. Josh Pate talked about how Miami has a bunch of animals and beasts on their roster in the trenches. Well, Oregon's the exact same there, except I think they're more talented in the backfield offensively and defensively and at the perimeter skill positions. Number 3 is Alabama, 7-1, same with Oregon. That loss to FSU looks weirder and weirder the further we get away from it. I'm, at this point, putting it up there with the Ohio State loss to Michigan last year, where it's flukish, and you have to take it into consideration. So that loss, much like the Ohio State loss to Michigan, basically eliminates those teams from being the greatest of all time caliber teams, but that's all it does. It doesn't stop them from doing anything else this year. All losses like that do is cap how a team is viewed in comparison with teams from other seasons that also won a title. It does not stop them from winning a title. Alabama, ever since that game, has taken steps forward defensively, offensively. I bumped them down from 1 to 3 because Ohio State had a bye. I'm not going to penalize them for that. Indiana looked ridiculously good against UCLA at home. And Alabama, they really could have lost that game to South Carolina. It wasn't just a sleepy performance where you're ahead for the whole game and you could lose, but the feeling is that you're somewhat in control. At one point, Alabama was out of control in the fourth quarter, and due to the clutchness of DeBoer and who they are as a team and a staff, they were able to come back and win. So just for now, have them down at 3. I do think there's a chance they could pass one of Indiana or Ohio State by the end of the year. Indiana's at 2nd, and if they continue to perform how they have in week 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, because week 1 was a bit of a slower game, they will eventually be number 1. Indiana, out of all the teams on this list, outside of maybe Texas Tech, is held back the most by priors. And every single week they show that the priors are less and less valuable. Doesn't mean that some of their talent limitations can't come through and hurt them. There is a good chance of that. But they've stayed healthier than they were last year. And in that game against UCLA where Aiden Fisher got hurt, they kept him out to be safe. Their backup, Isaiah Jones, came in. Him and Elijah Hardy made it look like Aiden Fisher was still on the field. They're deeper than they were last year. So the talent thing matters. That's definitely baked in to their power ratings. It's why S&P Plus and FPI are very close to unanimously having Indiana over Ohio State, but the sports books are not. There's clearly Ohio State and then the next 2 or 3 teams. The talent is baked in. But even the sports books have put Indiana as the second most likely team to win it all. They're the fastest riser. So if everything we've seen through 2 months of college football continues, Indiana will be number 1. But as of right now, I have to put Ohio State at 1. They have the best combination of wins on the field, of talent, of consistency, and current power rating. So I'm putting them at number 1. Right now, Ohio State's the best team in the country, and they just have, in the way that Oregon and Miami have insane athletes in the trenches, Ohio State has 1, 2 in Cade McDonald, but not as many in the trenches as Oregon and Miami do. They have aliens almost everywhere in the backfield and in skill position play, and Julian Sain's a stud. So I have Ohio State at 1 right now. They deserve to be the current favorites to win the national championship. I would pick them to beat anyone right now, neutral field. Depending on certain circumstances and matchups, I could pick them to lose to a team here or a team there. But neutral field, random location, Ohio State would be favored over everyone right now. Those are my top 10 power ratings, and thank you for watching. Let me know your thoughts down below. We can also finish off with our college football playoff predictions. But before then, got to text someone. Someone called me. All right. That's done. So let's move on and talk about my Week 10 college football playoff predictions. we're going to be talking about so many teams here, even teams that I think we'll spend a minute or so discussing. Here is my college football playoff bracket entering week 10 of the 2025 season. There has been so much chaos this year and so much uncertainty, and yet we may have several undefeated teams at the end of the regular season, and even after conference championship week, we may have several undefeated teams. Oh, I have to unlock the door. Someone has to stop by and do something, so I'll be right back. Sorry about this. All right, we're back. Thank you for your patience. Let me see what the chat is like today. People, I see a lot of complaints about my top 10 power ratings. Remember, ratings are not rankings. This is who I think would be favored over who on a neutral field. That's why Alabama's third. Alabama is like not even that far behind Indiana or Ohio State. They're not. If Michigan wins out, do you believe Michigan makes the Big Ten championship? I saw you talk about it in your video released today. There is a chance. It depends on if you're Michigan and you want to get to Indy, ideally you want to see Oregon take a loss, so you'll be tied with only Ohio State, and then you get the head-to-head over Ohio State to go. If it's a three-way tie with Oregon, Ohio State, and Michigan, it will come down to combined win-loss records of your conference opponents, and I don't think that would favor Michigan, especially given how Michigan State season has gone and how Purdue's season has gone, and Northwestern could lose out, for example. Maryland hasn't been too hot in conference, and that would not benefit Michigan. I actually am of the opinion, Metallica, to answer your question, Michigan would, I think it would be Ohio State or Oregon in that tiebreaker scenario. So that would actually, I think, benefit Michigan. I don't think Michigan would want to go to Indy with this team. It's an extra game that I don't think you have much of a chance at winning. It widens the margin for error. A 10-3 Michigan with a win over Ohio State and playing Oklahoma non-con wouldn't get left out, but you'd be the 12 seed or the 11 seed, and you'd be playing potentially the loser of like the SEC championship game or the Big Ten championship. Probably not the Big Ten championship game, but you'd be playing one of the better teams on the road after having to play in Indy and likely getting like beaten handily by Indiana. Because if you beat Ohio State and you have to play Ohio State at home, it's an emotional win. You're coming off. Then you have to play an Indiana team who has a bye and then a road trip to Purdue. Indiana will be more well-rested, and they're already better than Michigan. So that's my opinion. Don't know how much any of you agree with that. Michigan does have a path to Indy, but it's not very likely. They'd have to win out, and then maybe if it's a three-way tie, they could get in over Oregon or Ohio State. But you would want, ideally, Oregon to lose one of their remaining games, so you just get the head-to-head over Ohio State, and then you're guaranteed to get in. That trip to Iowa is going to be tough for Oregon, so there is a chance for some chaos there. Yeah, exactly, Metallica. You do not want Michigan reaching the Big Ten title game, because then you'll probably finish the year guaranteed 10-4. Like, it'd be fun as a Michigan fan. I think it's fun as an objective analyst, which is what I am in all of my videos. I would, from looking at the Michigan angle, you'd want to go 10-2 and have Ohio State or Oregon go to Indy. You sit home, get healthy, and at 10-2. Maybe you can bounce your way at being like the 8 seed and hosting a playoff game. And at that point, you can possibly get an 11th win or even a 12th win if the bracket's extremely friendly, for example. I like this one Oregon fan's comment talking about Ohio State has great pass blocking and they don't need great run blocking or rushing offense because their D is generationally good. Indy's the only team with no weaknesses. Yeah, Indiana's weaknesses are only theoretical. We have not really seen them emerge yet. That's it. Indiana, on paper, has no weaknesses. In theory, they do not have the depth or even talent necessary to probably win it all. But I'm not going to go with that right now. Let's get back to the task on hand and talk about my playoff bracket for Week 10. Here is my college football playoff bracket for Week 10. We've had a lot of chaos in these first 9 weeks of college football. Texas has 2 losses and is a combined 2 or 3 or 4 plays away from having 4. Penn State and Clemson have 4 losses. And Georgia Tech, BYU. These are all teams that are undefeated, which is just crazy. So let me show you my playoff bracket as it stands right now. So I think Memphis wins the American. It'll come down to Memphis or Tulane, I think, who wins the American. Maybe USF. They still have an outside chance. The champion of the American will be the G5 representative in the playoff. I think that's Memphis as of right now. For the 11th seed, I have Vanderbilt going 10-2. I have them losing to Texas, but beating everyone else. And therefore, they get in the playoffs. Pretty historic to have Vanderbilt with a 10-2 record reach the college football playoff. At 10th, I have Miami at 11-2. I have them winning out, reaching the ACC championship game, where I have them playing Georgia Tech, who's my 7th seed, who will be rematching with Miami in the playoffs. I think Tech is a bad matchup for Miami, especially the first time they play. So I have Tech winning that game, bouncing back from a loss to Georgia. At the 9 seed, I have Ole Miss at 11-1. I think they win out. Texas Tech, the 8 seed. I have them also winning out, winning the Big 12, and getting their due to tiebreakers. I have them beating Cincinnati in the Big 12 championship game, who would be left out. But if they won, you could see a lot of chaos where maybe 11-2 Tech gets in over, say, Vandy, and Cincy gets the automatic berth. For my 7 seed, we already talked about Georgia Tech. 6 seed, I have 11-1 Oregon winning out. I probably have a lot of teams, too many teams winning out, but I am going with it because of how outside of the SEC, a lot of the other conference slates are weakening. So the Big Ten, their November slate outside of the game and Iowa, Oregon, and much of Oregon's remaining schedule is pretty bad. And I think Oregon's a really good team. So I have them winning out. Georgia, I have winning out. They're my 5 seed at 11-1. So you have Memphis, Georgia, Ole Miss, Texas Tech, Vanderbilt, Oregon, Miami, Georgia Tech is your first round games. That's a pretty entertaining slate. And then for the first round buys, I have SEC runner-up Texas A&M as the 4 seed. I have Ohio State as the Big Ten runner-up at 12-1, the 3rd seed. I have Alabama, the SEC champion, as the 2 seed. and Indiana at number 1. Number 1. 13-0, Big Ten champs. So that is my playoff bracket as of right now. I do have some of these teams that, so like Ohio State losing to Indiana, for example. I think right now Ohio State is better than Indiana, but going off of current trends, Indiana is outperforming. They're outperforming everyone. And at this point, because there's so much chaos and it's too hard to predict, I'm kind of going off of what I see from the trends. So what I see from the trends is Indiana is getting better and better in the power ratings at a rate that no one else is really matching up with. So don't know how sustainable that is, and that's baked into my playoff predictions that you'll see here. Don't know if they're going to win at all, but that's what I have as of right now. That's also why I have Texas Tech winning out, even though they have a loss in Big 12 play, and they have some tough games coming up to where if they lose one of those, they'll be out. So I'm trying not to predict too much chaos here, because that could make the playoff bracket extremely messy and even unrealistic. There's a very good chance this is wrong, but I'm doing it for fun. So let's look at the quarterfinal matches. I believe Georgia, Texas Tech, Oregon, and Georgia Tech all win. So all the home teams win. Miami would be the most likely team to pull off the upset. Same with Ole Miss, but I think Tech would destroy Ole Miss at the lines of scrimmage. I believe that Georgia Tech's ability to shorten games and Miami's limited offense would help Georgia Tech, especially at home, to beat Miami in another close game. They also have the coaching edge. Oregon beating Vandy and Georgia beating Memphis are pretty self-explanatory. So we have Georgia playing A&M, Texas Tech playing Indiana, an Oregon-Ohio State rematch from the Rose Bowl, and Georgia Tech playing Alabama. The Alabama and Ohio State bowl locations would probably be flipped. Alabama would probably have the Sugar Bowl. Ohio State would probably have the Orange Bowl, but I can't imagine since one's in Louisiana, the other's in Florida, Alabama's closer to both of them than Ohio State. It wouldn't provide that much of a difference, honestly. But those are the quarterfinal matchups that I'm projecting. I have Ohio State beating Oregon. At one point, I thought that Oregon would outpace Ohio State and these other teams at the top. I don't think that way anymore because I have seen enough sketchy things from Oregon and enough limitations on their passing offense where I need to see them win out, even though I'm predicting them to. I need to see them win out in a certain style before I put them back in that Tier 1A. Right now they're in Tier 1B with A&M, who I have losing to Georgia. This is mostly a coaching thing, as I think A&M right now is actually better than Georgia, but I trust Kirby Smart, and I think they will get some things figured out as the season goes on. So a little bit of projection there in favor of the Bulldogs, just trust in Kirby Smart, even though I like what A&M could do to Georgia and what they provide in that game. It's a little bit similar to Ohio State over Oregon. I think Oregon could match up well with Ohio State in a lot of ways, and Oregon is caught up with Ohio State compared to where they were last year. But I've seen Day coach against Lanning twice, and he is a better coach than Lanning. So with the bye, I especially give Ohio State that edge there, and then Georgia, I like Kirby Smart over Elko, and think that with that game with Memphis, they'd be able to get some juice. Not exactly completely consistent reasons as to why I'm picking those results, but hey, results in college football aren't always consistent or make sense. Alabama would smoke Tech. I think Tech would have a fantastic season regardless, but Alabama's much more talented. They'd be taking Tech pretty seriously. Indiana wouldn't smoke Texas Tech quite as badly as Alabama would Georgia Tech, but I think Indiana would win decisively. And in both of those games, the 2 seed and the 1 seed would probably have some backups playing late in the fourth quarter. And that helped me decide who the semifinal results would be, or what the semifinal results would be, and who the national title participants would be. I think Alabama would beat Georgia. To this degree, there's been nothing that has shown me Indiana is worse than Georgia, really anywhere. Indiana has the better players at this point. Do they have the better depth? No, especially in theory, but in practice, they have the better players. On paper, they are the better team. They're better coached, I would argue, and that's saying something because Smart's one of the best in the business. At this point, I'm going to roll the die with really either Indiana or Ohio State is who I think the two best teams are. Analytically, they're separating themselves a bit. I went with Indiana here over Georgia in part because I don't think Tech would give them a 60-minute game, while A&M would give Georgia a 60-minute game. Indiana would come in here more rested. They already are ahead of Georgia by enough to where I could give them benefit of the doubt and assume that holds. Alabama and Ohio State is a similar story. Ohio State would have to play Oregon and then Alabama. Alabama would have to play Georgia Tech and then Ohio State. So who will likely get more rest entering the game? Alabama. It's very close. Very, very, very close. I think that game ultimately would decide who wins it all because I have Indiana, Ohio State, and Alabama right now as my top three, and I think at the end of the year that will be the top three. If Ohio State beats Alabama, they would win it all because I don't think that they would lose to Indiana twice because they have some favorable matchups over Indiana. Indiana loves to run a lot of zone defensively. I would trust Julian Sain and those receivers to tear that apart. Alabama, with DeBoer and with their secondary, which I think is more talented than Indiana's, I believe would be better suited to face off against that Ohio State team. And the fact that they have to play Tech, who I'd assume they would be beating handily by halftime or early third quarter, while Ohio State and Oregon would be a war that could go to overtime. Rest would go with Alabama, and special teams. Special teams could decide that game too. Not exactly as confident in that with Indiana and Georgia, although both of their special teams are better than both of Alabama and Ohio State special teams units. So 1 seed versus 2 seed, and all the seeds are top 5 in the semifinals. So that's a different thing from last year's 12-team playoff. That's in part due to the changes as to who gets the first round buys. My national champion in this scenario is going to be Indiana. I'm going to roll the dice with it. Again, this could very well be wrong. I think Indiana is on pace to becoming that number 1 team at the end of the year, but that's an opinion I just formed this week. Last week, I thought it was Alabama. The year before that, or the week before that, I thought it was Ohio State. Right now, I have Ohio State as number 1. Just think that at the end of the year, it's not as certain as some would think that they're going to have the championship. We'll see how all of this works out. Some teams that could make it before we finish this segment that I didn't place here. Michigan. I can't pick them to beat Ohio State right now. Last week I could, but the Michigan State team showed me enough flaws where I'm bouncing back. That's a 50-50 game for me right now. If it weren't a rivalry and if it weren't at home for Michigan, I think Ohio State would win pretty decisively. But given the history of that game recently and the fact that Michigan is projected to be Ohio State's toughest opponent of the regular season, I don't know. So I'm going back and forth there, but as of this week, I'd pick Ohio State to win that game. If Michigan wins, they're certainly in the playoffs, even if they go to Indy and lose by 50 to Indiana. They probably would still be in. Maybe not in that case, but it's possible. Texas. Texas is another team where if they put everything together that they've shown me, so at times they've had an elite defense, Manning at times has looked good. Against Ohio State, their offensive line for the most part looked good. If they put all of that together, they could win out and they could be in the playoffs and then be a very dangerous team. But until I see that happening, I can't pick that. I have them going, I think, 8-4 as of right now. You also have Cincinnati, Utah, BYU, and Louisville, who I picked them to lose some games that are chaos games. If they win some of those games I'm projecting them to lose, they'll certainly be in the playoffs and could even host some games. It's absolutely incredible that BYU's undefeated and that Louisville's in a position to potentially go 11-1. This is what makes college football incredible. That's my Week 10 college football playoff bracket. Expect this to be wrong. and expect changes next week after we see plenty of these teams play, and I can recalibrate and just turn the nozzle or the knob a little bit. Now we can actually get on to some games. That's what we can do now. And these are previews that I'm very excited for because while Penn State isn't good, and I was pretty convinced that they would be good. Wait, what? Oh, nothing. That's from my urgent care visit about my ankle. Yeah, I for a minute there I thought I did to my ankle what Drew Aller did, where he broke it. For a minute, I thought I broke my ankle this past Friday. But here we are on Monday. Swelling's mostly down, not up to full strength. I should be up to full strength by Friday, which is when I need to help move my family again, thankfully. But it doesn't seem to be broken, and it's healing quite nicely. Ohio State by 10 plus, Sage, Ohio. We'll get to it, but I agree with that. If the spread weren't 20.5, I'd confidently pick Ohio State to cover, but it's 20.5. Like, especially given Ohio State's style of play, that's a lot of points. Ohio State's style of play so far has been, we are going to turtle up when it comes to controlling the clock. And outside of that, if we want to, we'll be pass heavy. If we want to, we'll be run heavy. We trust the defense to take care of everything. That's not a style of play that usually results in big blowouts with massive point spreads against teams that at least have a top 15 caliber talent roster. Not usually. But also Penn State is an interim head coach, and Ohio State at this point is probably better at not every position, but close to every position. And especially at the positions that matter. Their season is still alive. Penn State's season is dead. But let's get to it and talk about Ohio State and Penn State. The Penn State Nittany Lions travel to Columbus, Ohio to play against the number 1 Ohio State Buckeyes. Ohio State stands at 7-0, 4-0 in Big Ten Conference play. Penn State's 3-4 with a gnarly 0-4 record in Big Ten Conference play. Ohio State's favored by 20.5 points. This is a noon game, 12 p.m. Eastern Time, big noon kickoff. Gus Johnson, Joel Klatt will be there and will be calling this game. I thought this was going to be potentially the game of the century earlier this year and possibly in the preseason. Wow, how the mighty or thought to be mighty in the case of Penn State have fallen. This team in Penn State, little bit of a rant here, ruined much of the Big Ten November slate. I thought we were going to get Indiana and Penn State, and that would be a big game. Ohio State and Penn State could be a big game. Iowa, Penn State, thought would be a bigger game than it was. And it was close and it was entertaining, but didn't have the same stakes. What about Michigan State hosting Penn State off a bye? Maybe they could attempt an upset. No. And that really affected a lot of games in a very negative way by Penn State being pretty terrible, and none of the teams that were supposed to be terrible stepped up and were really good. Really, Penn State subtracted itself from the top tier of the Big Ten, and no one filled that void. No other team at the top of the preseason hierarchy, at least as I saw it, has done much differently than what I thought they were going to. Minus, to a certain degree, Indiana. Indiana was a little bit better than I thought they would be. Man, Indiana, Ohio State, number 1, number 2 team in all of America. Top 2 in odds to win it all. Top 2 in FPI. Top 2 in S&P Plus. But let's get to this game. So Penn State being a massive underdog means that there's going to have to be a lot to go their way if they are going to win, let alone compete. They dominated their weak non-conference slate, and every loss since then has been a loss by 6 points or fewer. Close loss after close loss after close loss. This team, power ratings wise, is similar to 2021 Nebraska, where a bunch of close losses to teams irrespective of their power rating and competition level, and you blow out the week. That is what Penn State has been through 7 games. And their remaining schedule, got to play at Ohio State, got to return home to play Indiana, play Michigan State on the road, host Nebraska, play at Rutgers. Very good chance this team could go 3-9. There is also a decent enough chance that they could maybe go to a bowl game at 6-6. I think that's only if they survive Ohio State and Indiana and beat Michigan State, Nebraska, and Rutgers. So starting off 3-0, you're 3-6 entering your final 3 games, and you finish off 3-0. Would be pretty interesting, pretty comical, hilarious. In order for them to win this game, a lot is to go their way, and we'll get to that. For Ohio State, number 1 in America ranked. They're 7-0. They're coming off a shutout 34-0 win over Wisconsin. Both teams are coming off a bye, by the way. After Penn State, a trip, a weird kickoff at 1 p.m. Eastern time at Purdue. They're going to host UCLA, host Rutgers, then travel to Michigan. Michigan, you wouldn't know it by their ranking, but they, from a power ratings plus home field advantage and plus rivalry aspect, will probably be Ohio State's toughest test of the year by a decent margin. So that is, it's known as the game, the rivalry between Ohio State and Michigan, but it is going to also literally, in the sense of the defining game of the regular season, from one top program in Ohio State, currently the best program in America, to the best team on their schedule. It will literally be the game of their schedule. That was thought to be Texas or Penn State from a competitive angle. It's not. Texas is a 5-2 team. Well, actually, I think 6-2 now, but maybe 5-2, that has almost lost 2 additional games, and Penn State's 3-4. So this schedule has been pretty beneficial, pretty easy for Ohio State. We'll see what happens, but I would expect them to enter that Michigan game 11-0 based on what we know right now, and they'll be favored over Michigan. They will not be an underdog in any of the remaining regular season games, barring something outer worldly and probably like spiritual or something crazy to happen. Looking at the key players and the numbers for this game, and how, if there is a path at all for Penn State to be able to come out on top here. Penn State's defense has really, really struggled against the run. More importantly, against offenses where the quarterback is involved in the rushing attack. So Mark Gronowski tore them up on the ground. Nico Iamaleava tore them up on the ground. They did not have a good or fun time trying to get Dante Moore down in the backfield. Their pass rush isn't great. Their ability to QB spy, to slow down the QB run, isn't great. I wonder if Ohio State, since Sayin showed against Wisconsin on one play that he can run the read option, probably more of a, in case of emergency, break glass type play, but they can do it. So I wonder if you'll see that in this game, or people have talked about the Lincoln Keenholz packages before. I don't think that's even worth to implement, because are you going to trust him to throw as much as you do Sayin? Is he even that much better of a runner than Sayin is, because he's shown some underrated speed in the pocket and on that read option? I don't know what Ohio State's going to do there, but Penn State hasn't exactly struggled to the same degree against rushing offenses that do not involve QB run as much. So Oregon, at the end of the day, was able to physically pound them on the ground, but that was in part due to Penn State not having any offense, and their defense was always on the field. They didn't do as poorly of a job against Oregon or against Northwestern's ground game as they did against Iowa and UCLA's, because their quarterback is directly involved in the ground game and can pick up big plays, because they either don't QB spy or they do, and their linebackers without Rojas are pretty bad at it. So that's an interesting matchup there. If Penn State is able to stall Ohio State's rushing attack and Ohio State wants to stubbornly run, as they've shown in really all of their games but the Wisconsin game, then Penn State should be able to get off the field here and there, and it comes down to whether or not their offense can move the football at all against Ohio State's defense. A defense that is first in points allowed per play, only allowing 0.113 points per play. That is not something I'm going to talk about much, because that is going to be a prove-it moment for Penn State's offense. There's nothing in theory or on paper that says Penn State should score more than a field goal or 10 points at most. Maybe because they have good special teams, they can get lucky and force a turnover, or they can, hit a pretty long field goal with Barker. I don't know, but there's a more realistic shot that Penn State gets shut out than they score 3 times. There is that possibility that Ohio State wins this game 30-0 or even 40-0. There's a chance at that. So if Penn State is going to compete here, or if Ohio State is going to play with its food and allow Penn State to be in this game, it will be the Ohio State offense versus the Penn State defense. Because this Penn State offense without Drew Aller, with Ethan Grunkmeyer at quarterback, unless their offensive line shows up and they're able to run it 20 times in a row with Katron Allen and Singleton's able to step up, and they're able to do that even with Ohio State knowing they're going to run, then they're not going to score points here. Looking at Penn State, I'd pay attention to Katron Allen and then Olavega Ione and Drew Shelton. They're 2 highest graded offensive linemen. Ione is a future NFL guard. Shelton could be a future NFL tackle. Penn State's offensive line, I don't think is the problem. It's not the unit I thought it was going to be preseason, where I viewed it as a Joe Moore Award unit. It's not, but it's also not the problem. The problem is the receivers haven't panned out the way Penn State wanted to. I don't think Kodal Nicki did a great job utilizing the talent on this offense and adjusting his scheme to it, and the quarterback injury is also pretty bad. And Singleton has not been good this year. Defensively, Denida Sutton at D-end is their best player on the defensive front, along with Amari Campbell, and then King Mack and Zakee Wheatley at safety should do a pretty good job. I expect Jim Knowles in this game to play 2 high safety against Ohio State, where traditionally Penn State's played 1 high safety, I believe, against Ohio State. So that should help limit some of the previous advantages that Ohio State's offense has had over Penn State's defense in regards to pass offense versus pass defense. Ohio State, meanwhile, pay attention to Julian Sayin at quarterback, Jeremiah Smith, Carnell Tate. Look at the running backs, Isaiah West and Bo Jackson. I wonder if Ohio State will be able to run here or not. I wonder if they'll even need to run to cover the spread against Penn State, because their passing offense is that effective. And then defensively, Arvell Reese, Sonny Styles, Caleb Downs, and then defensive tackle Caden McDonald. Pay attention to them. This Ohio State team should have a big day. I would expect them to win. I'm going to predict them to win. This is not the Penn State team I thought it would be preseason. Ohio State is maybe a little bit better than I thought they'd be preseason. About the same team, better defensively, similar offensively, but a little bit more inconsistent. And special teams is actually worse. I thought with the addition of Jackson Corville, they'd be better there, but Corville isn't even their starting kicker. He isn't. Jaden Fielding is still the starting kicker. Ohio State will win. I'm confident in that. But 20.5 is a pretty big number considering Ohio State's style of play, where they want to limit possessions. This game has kind of a personal feeling to it between Ryan Day and Jim Knowles. I believe that Day will want to run up the score, and will he be able to? That's a different question, but I'm hedging a little bit. Given how I think the Ohio State staff wants to win this game, and how Penn State is talented enough to not totally lay down and die, I feel as if Ohio State is either going to win this game by 50, or this game will be a 1-score game in the fourth quarter, and Ohio State fans will want half the staff fired. So I'm hedging in between that. It won't be a close game in the fourth quarter, but it also won't be a 40-point win. So I'm hedging in between what I think are the 2 most likely outcomes. I'm picking Ohio State to win probably by 14 or 17 points is what I'm thinking. 20.5 is just a bit too big of a number, but Ohio State will win. They'll clearly be the better team from the minute the ball's kicked off. They match up well, I think, in every way with Penn State, minus maybe Penn State's rushing defense, because they won't want to run Sayin, I don't think. And whether it's Ohio State's backs or the offensive line being, a great unit overall, but their specialties in pass blocking, they're not bad at run blocking, but they're not good there either. I think that Penn State will limit them on the ground. Ohio State will also limit Penn State on the ground. What's going to win is that Ohio State's just so much more talented. They're better coached. They're at home. And that quarterback and wide receiver duo is unstoppable unless you have offense to score here and there on Patricia's epic defense. That's my opinion on this game. That's my take. Ohio State wins and covers. This game doesn't impact the Big Ten standings all that much unless Penn State does the absolute unthinkable and wins. Penn State's one of the few teams that does not have yet a win in Big Ten play. Meanwhile, Ohio State is undefeated in Big Ten play. Ohio State will win and cover, moving on to 8-0. 5-0 in Big Ten play, and Penn State will still be searching for their first Big Ten Conference victory. Vanderbilt and Texas, this is a fascinating game that I am so excited to watch. Also, it will be at noon, so on the quad, on the quad box, on the multi-view on YouTube TV, I'll probably have Rutgers, Illinois, Vanderbilt, Texas, Miami, SMU, and Ohio State, Penn State, if I can find that for multi-view. If I can find that combination. That is what I will have. 9th ranked Vanderbilt. Say that again. 9th ranked Vanderbilt. Top 10 Vanderbilt. Travels to a 2-loss Texas team that's ranked 20th. Who would have thought that Vanderbilt versus Texas would be a critical, fork-in-the-road, pivotal game in the month of November, to kick off November on November 1st. Raise your hand. Tell me in the comment section below if you thought that way. I did not. I was too low on Vanderbilt and too high on Texas. That's all I will say here. I do not think Arch Manning plays in this game. Texas is only favored by 2.5 points. Based on the matchups here, how Arch Manning played against Mississippi State, and the fact that Mississippi State had almost a flukishly good performance against a Texas defense that had not allowed any offense, whether Ohio State, Florida, Oklahoma, to move on them as Mississippi State did. I do think this defense will come back down to earth, regress to the mean in a positive way, especially since this is their first home game in a month. First home game in a month for Texas. And yet the spread's only 2.5. I could see it come down lower, or I could see it go more in Texas's direction. I think depending on the Arch Manning news, that's where you'll get your movement. I do not think he plays here. That injury against Mississippi State looked like something that will take a little bit to recover from. Let's take a pop at Vanderbilt's schedule here. They have a very real chance at reaching the playoffs. In my playoff bracket, I picked them to reach the playoffs as one of the road teams, playing Oregon on the road. That's my current projection for Vanderbilt. I struggle to see them beating all of Texas, Auburn, Kentucky, and Tennessee. They should crush Kentucky. Auburn should be a win, but they're hanging on just enough with that win over Arkansas to where Hugh Freeze will probably still be the head coach. He'll still be fighting to keep his job. That'll be a motivated, tough Auburn opponent. And Texas and Tennessee are more talented than Vanderbilt. Tennessee's traditionally owned Vanderbilt. Even last year when Vandy was overperforming, Tennessee really made it hard for Vanderbilt to scale with Tennessee's style, and they pulled away pretty quickly and blew them out. And Texas on the road's no easy chore. You're an underdog here. The job that Clark Lee, that Tim Beck, Jerry Kill, that they have done has been phenomenal, especially on offense. Defensively, they've had some struggles, but they still have some good players there. The way that they've recruited, developed, scouted is at the top of any ranking of front offices or CEO jobs or general manager jobs. For Texas, they have to win out if they want to be in the playoffs or in Atlanta. Vanderbilt is to win out if they want to be in Atlanta, I think. But a 10-2 Vandy with the schedule they've played and the fact that their only loss at this point is to Alabama, I believe would be in. Texas at 10-2 would be in, but they can't afford a loss. They got to beat Vanderbilt at home, then they get a much needed bye before traveling to Georgia. And then you host Arkansas. That's a tricky spot, right in between the road game at Georgia and a home game against a possibly undefeated A&M team. Both are better than you. Both are power rated higher than you, at least in my metrics and any metrics that can accurately account for how bad Texas has performed in their recent 2 games. A&M's power rated higher than Texas. Having that Arkansas team there is tough. This is one of the tougher November schedules in America. Vanderbilt's better than I thought. A&M's better than I thought, even though I was high on them preseason. Georgia's about the same, where I had Georgia as a top 5 rated team preseason, mostly based on the fact at the end of the year I thought they'd be there. I do think they'll clean up stuff as the year goes on. And Arkansas is actually better than I thought they would be. They just have a similar record because their schedule's hard and Sam Pittman was incompetent. And they have no defense. This game is very important for Texas. And the fact that they do not have their starting quarterback in a game like this is painful. So why is Texas favored if they don't have their starting quarterback? Why? Against a Vanderbilt team that is hot, that knows how to play with limited possessions, that has outcoached the majority of its opponents, and is more than punched above its weight class this year. Why? Why is Texas favored? Well, I think Texas is favored here. Because they're at home. The 2.5 line actually implies that neutral field would be a pick 'em or you'd slide Vanderbilt's way. And if this were at Vanderbilt, even if Manning were healthy, I think that Vanderbilt would be favored. Probably by a point, maybe a 1.5, or maybe Manning means that much and Texas would be favored, but by less than they currently are. Texas on defense has almost been flawless outside of a quarter against Florida and the 4 quarters against Mississippi State 2 days ago. It's one of the best defenses in America. And what they are particularly good at is stopping the run. The pass defense is what's caught them with their pants down at times. Mississippi State, Florida, and Ohio State for a drive. Basically able to exploit that Texas secondary, which they like to play single high safety at times. They love to be aggressive with PK, and these teams with better receivers, with good QBs, and then Jeff Lebby is the master of tempo. They can sometimes get those defenses. And Texas, remember, they lost the Thorpe Award winner last year. They lost Makuba to the draft. They returned more quality players on their defensive front and brought in more quality players from the portal in the defensive front than in the defensive backfield. Vanderbilt is this team that beats you more so with their triple option attack and Pavia. They can be good through the air, but their ground game and the quarterback run is integral to their success. And Texas does a good job at defending that. And Texas's offense, they have receivers that slowly but surely, I've seen Ryan Wingo come along. DeAndre Moore is their highest rated receiver. They have talent there. And Vanderbilt is also a defense that's susceptible to screens. It's a defense that is not as good as the offense for Vanderbilt. And Texas has enough talent and athleticism to where they should be able to put some points on this Vandy defense. This game is going to come down to, regardless of whether Manning plays or not, it's going to come down to the Texas defense and the Vanderbilt offense. And particularly Texas stopping the run and whether or not Vanderbilt is going to be able to have a consistent enough ground game to move the football, to play off of their triple option, limiting possessions offense, and whether or not with the limiting possessions they will be effective enough at moving the ball. Because if Texas gets a few punts and stops, Texas then can control the possession game, and that's where Vanderbilt usually gets in trouble. Keep an eye out for, outside of Diego Pavia for Vanderbilt, their tight ends, Cole Spence and Eli Stowers. They're going to have to match up against Michael Taff or whichever safety is playing in his spot if he's still out. And they're also going to have to be matching up against these linebackers for Texas. So Brad Spence, Anthony Hill, anyone else there? You're going to have to match up against those powerful Texas linebackers and safeties. On defense, Corday Seidnor and Miles Capers, the defensive ends, I'm curious to see how or if Texas is able to protect their quarterback. They've really struggled at doing so, protecting the quarterback and even getting a push in the ground game. And also watch out for Langston Patterson at linebacker for Vanderbilt. Texas, it's Arch Manning if he plays, but I don't think he will. I would still watch out for him. He's a key player in this game. If he plays here, I think this game could get pretty ugly based on what I have seen from him against Mississippi State, Oklahoma, and the fact that Vanderbilt is not known for their pass defense here. They're known for their run defense and their run offense, then pass offense, and pass defense is in a very distant last place for what they're known for. They'll probably will be starting Matthew Caldwell is who they'll probably be starting. DeAndre Moore Jr. at wide receiver, then tackle Trevor Gooseby are other players to pay attention to for the Longhorns. And defensively, Colin Simmons, Ethan Burke, Michael Taff, Anthony Hill, Manny Muhammad, Cole Brevard, Hero Kanu. Pay attention to those guys on the interior of the Texas front, the pass rushers. This is going to be a huge game. And again, it's going to be Texas's first home game in a minute. We have not seen Texas play at home last since, I believe, Sam Houston State? Really? It's been that long? That's crazy. Yes, that was the last game, because after that game they were 3-1 and they hadn't played an SEC game yet. That's crazy. So this place is going to be bumping. It's going to be loud. They are going to want a huge win. If whether or not Sark is lying or telling the truth about how he has no interest in an NFL job, him and the roster are going to be mad over those reports. And I think you'll see that in this game. Some people will say this is counterintuitive. Others will say I'm just being a contrarian for contrarian's sake. I love Texas in this spot. I think that any number below 3 is way too much in Vandy's favor. And if Manning plays, Texas will win this game, I think, by double digits. I could be wrong. It's a bad matchup. Alabama was a better matchup for Vanderbilt because Alabama's run defense has some issues. And their rushing offense has not shown the same ceiling that Texas might have. This game is probably Vanderbilt's worst matchup of the year, looking at where the game's played, the location on the schedule, the fact that it's pretty far distanced from a bye for Vanderbilt, and how Texas is returning to play their first home game in a month. I believe that Texas will win. Texas will cover here. The Longhorns are still going to be alive in the college football playoff race and technically the race to Atlanta in the SEC championship game. Love Texas's pass defense and rush defense in this game. Texas will get things here and there in the passing offense. It'll be inconsistent. It will be an ugly win, but Texas will control the game mostly from start to finish. I do believe that the overall team goes Texas's way. If I had to change one thing on this list, I didn't think too much about it before exporting that graphic. I would put Clark Lee and Steve Sarkisian equal in terms of the staff, but Texas's staff is pretty underrated. I think that a lot of the issues that Texas has, and this is on staff, but I don't think a lot of this is an indictment of Texas's position coaches when I look at how their team is performing this year. Some of it's on the O-line, but a lot of this is also on Arch Manning and how he just has not performed to the level that Texas thought he would, or that anyone really watching football outside of a few people who were well ahead of the curve thought he would perform. So I still think Texas is one of the better staffs in college football, even with their failures. I still think that many of Penn State's coaches are still amongst the best in football. The head coach was just responsible. Same thing with LSU. Yeah, head coaches matter a lot. And I don't think Sarkisian is an elite head coach, but I think he's wonderful. So Texas has matchup advantages here. This game would impact the standings quite a bit because Vanderbilt and Texas are currently tied in the standings for 5th. The loser would, after this Saturday, drop a few spots. The winner would rise a spot or two. and they would be in that conversation with an outside shot to go to Atlanta, depending on what happens with Texas A&M or with Alabama. Horns win, Horns cover. I would not be shocked if I were wrong, even though I'm confident in Texas, just because of the coaching job that Vanderbilt's done and their ability to win and control close competitive games. It's going to be an awesome game, an awesome Saturday. A little bit of a deep breath there. And we will try to be live again tonight at some point. Don't know if it'll be 6. Will probably be 7 or 8 at the latest. But I'm hoping to be live at 6 if at all possible. The graphics for the show that I want to do tonight are going to be easier to export and easier to type out stuff than today's graphics. This is the bigger show. Let's talk about Miami traveling to SMU. The Miami Hurricanes, 10th ranked, bowl eligible as of 2 days ago, as of Saturday night, 6-1, 2-1, travel to the also one-loss ACC SMU Mustangs, who are 5-3. Losses to 2 Big 12 teams in close games, and a close loss to Wake Forest that was just yikes. Ouch. Painful loss. Probably a bit of a look-ahead spot for SMU. This game is big. It's a bit personal, I think, for Rhett Lashley, who was at one point the offensive coordinator for Miami, who a friend of my channel, JT Sports, has mentioned as someone who he'd like to replace Cristobal if Cristobal were to somehow leave or not work out. Both great coaching staffs, defenses that, especially in terms of their trench play, are among some of the best in the nation, and both of these teams technically have an outside shot to Charlottesville and the ACC championship game. Miami is an 11.5 point favorite here. Let's talk about the Canes first and foremost, as they are playing the road team. SMU's playing the host. Miami, my goodness, they have fallen a bit ever since that win over Florida State. Back-to-back wins over the Florida schools. They're in a much better position than either of those two as a program, as a job, from a recruiting and roster angle, and they physically killed both of them. They ended their seasons, really. Florida and Florida State had a chance in those games to potentially end Miami's season and extend their own. Miami, along with Virginia, helped start the downward spiral for Florida State. And Florida, after the losses to LSU and USF, needed that win over Miami. Just couldn't get it done. Those wins against Notre Dame and South Florida look so far gone. I don't even know if they're visible in the rearview mirror because the Stanford performance wasn't good. Louisville was able to beat them physically and out-scheme them and get behind their secondary and linebackers just enough to win, and also get into Beck's head enough with the 4 interceptions. This is a massive game for the Miami Hurricanes because they can't afford another loss. If they go 10-2 again, 6-2 in the ACC, they're not making the playoffs because A&M, Indiana, and Ohio State are undefeated. Georgia, Ole Miss, Alabama, Oregon, those are teams with only one loss that are in better conferences, that have played better opponents in conference, that actually have a similar chance or better than Miami of reaching their conference championship game. It's just too much competition. Then you have undefeated Georgia Tech. Louisville's the head-to-head win over you. Duke, if they win out, they could theoretically get in over Miami for the ACC championship game. You got Texas Tech, and then it's a 12-team playoff, but one of those spots is reserved for the G5. Miami has zero margin for error. Zero. They have to win this game. They have to beat Syracuse, NC State, Virginia Tech, and Pitt on the road. They have to beat all of those teams and win out. And if they're going to, this is their toughest test outside of maybe Pitt at the end of the year in November. They have to start winning now. For SMU, lost to Baylor in a game you should have won. Should have played TCU closer. There were just some crazy things that happened in favor of the Horned Toads, the Horned Frogs. And Wake Forest is just inexcusable loss, very painful. There's also been some bright spots. Went over Clemson on the road, how they were able to initially control Baylor, and how I think they're the better team than Baylor. Baylor was just able to come back and regain momentum. They have an outside shot at declaring the season a success. They have an outside shot at getting to Charlottesville. They have opportunities against Miami and Louisville at home. And BC on the road and Cal on the road should be weak enough opponents to where they could, in theory, win out. And at 9-3, I'd call that a successful season for SMU. I don't even call 8-4. With how much they lost, a successful season for the SMU Mustangs. So, critical game, critical swing game for both these teams, because the loser in all likelihood is eliminated from the ACC championship game conversation and therefore the college football playoff conversation. Some matchups to pay attention to here. Miami loves to run the ball. They love to run it in between the tackles. Love it, love it, love it. SMU is among one of the nation's best teams in run defense. They are 13th in yards allowed per carry, only allowing 3.82 yards per carry. In terms of expected points added per rush, they are 6th, only allowing opponents a negative 0.19 expected EPA per rush. And in terms of rushing success rate, they are 18th, allowing a 34.6 rushing success rate. This is going to be tough for Miami to run the ball and get out of here with a good win. SMU will probably do a good job at stopping it, at least initially, and they have enough firepower, just enough offensively to maybe get the Miami defense here and there. This is going to be a game that if Miami wants to win, not just in style, because that's not important at this point, just winning is important, but if they want to win, if they want to play their best cards, you have to trust Carson Beck. Initially, trust him. And if you can't, then you turtle up, you do what you're good at, play defense, win the lines of scrimmage, hopefully escape with a win. But Miami's offense has not been all that spectacular, whether at running the ball or passing. They've been good, but they're not great. They're not even close to the elite unit they were last year at times. And SMU, they're similar, where they're better defensively and they're capable enough offensively to put things together. These teams are similarly built, I would argue. Stronger in the trenches. They have quarterbacks with high ceilings but low floors. Could have NFL futures, especially Carson Beck. And their secondaries are their weaker part of the defense. But Miami's the more talented overall team. They're better in efficiency on both sides of the football. For the Canes, pay attention to Carson Beck, quarterback, Malachi Toney, wide receiver, and of course, the talented best offensive tackle in the upcoming NFL draft, Francis Mauigoa. Their D-line, Ruben Bain Jr., Akeem Mesidor, David Blay, Ahmad Moten Sr., Justin Scott. Pay attention to that unit. And if SMU decides to run there, or if maybe they try to attack this Miami defense in more creative ways. Keontae Scott, forget if he's a nickel back or a corner. I think he's their nickel. Their best DB per PFF, pay attention to him too, the incoming transfer from Houston before transferring from Auburn. SMU, look at Kevin Jennings and then his offensive line, P.J. Williams at tackle and Joshua Bates at center. Pay attention to T.J. Harden, their running back too. And then defensively, Jeffrey Mba at D-tackle, Ja'Kai Long at D-end, and Cameron Robinson at D-end. They also have an impressive, at least in the preseason, because their pass defense has been quite atrocious at times. They're allowing over 7 yards per drop back, and their EPA per play allowed in terms of pass defense is barely above average. So they're also 134th in passing yards allowed per game, but that's what happens when you play TCU and Baylor, who are quite good at that. But in theory, Ahmad Moses and Isaiah Nwokobia are some of the best safeties in America. I'm not confident in Miami after that Louisville game and also after the Stanford game where they had a very slow start. But in the preseason, I should have went with my research more that said that Miami was a deeper team than Clemson. This was before we knew Clemson was a fraud. And Cristobal has had moments this year where he looked like he's about to choke and then doesn't. This team's more clutch than last year's, at least from what I can tell. So I'm going to go with Miami and trust Cristobal a bit. And I'm going to pick them to win. But I believe that SMU covers. I think that Miami will win a one-score game, or they'll win by 10 or maybe maybe 11 if SMU kicks enough field goals and it's, an 11-point game instead of a 10-point game. I think 11.5 is a bit too much there. Miami's passing offense should have success, but just because it should have success doesn't mean they will. And outside of that, I think that SMU can match up with Miami pretty well in a variety of ways. Both of these offenses should be pigeonholed into passing. I would trust Beck and Tony there more than I would Kevin Jennings and Jordan Hudson or RJ Maryland, who's actually made the move to wide receiver, and it's Hibner at tight end now. But I think Miami's the better team here. Staff's pretty equal. Would lean Miami if I had to lean one way. Miami's the better overall team, though, so they will win. And as for the ACC standings, Miami currently, they're alone at 7th. SMU's tied with Louisville and Duke for 4th. Pittsburgh's in the picture. I didn't even realize that. Pittsburgh technically has an outside shot to get to the playoffs. That's toxic. And then Virginia and Georgia Tech being undefeated. What even is this conference, man? It's awesome because of how chaotic and because of how bad this is. Miami and SMU both need a win here, especially Miami. If you're Miami and you finish outside of the top third of this conference, despite being its best team in power ratings, or maybe at worst its second best, you need to make changes even though you've made progress. I mean, that would just be unacceptable. This is a must-win for Miami. Luckily for them, I think they will get it done. We'll see, though. Now we can move into the afternoon slate, talking about Indiana at Maryland. And then we have 2 night games, USC, Nebraska, and, before I forget, Oklahoma, Tennessee. The undefeated second-ranked Indiana Hoosiers, who debuted in S&P Plus as the number 1 team in America. As Bill Connolly said, the center of college football, the epicenter, is Bloomington, Indiana. Crazy, amazing times we're living in. They travel on the road in the first of a 2-part road series to Maryland and then to Penn State. Indiana's favored by 21.5 points here. Kickoff will be at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time on CBS. Indiana's playing the road team here, so let's start off having a conversation about them. Ever since that game against Old Dominion where they did not cover the spread, and Old Dominion had some pretty long runs and was able to move the ball pretty successfully, the Hoosiers have been putting pedal to the metal against their opponents, beating Kennesaw State 56-9, Indiana State 73-0, Illinois 63-10. Iowa was a bit concerning there for a minute, but they won. They were the better team. They then beat Oregon 30-20, Michigan State 38-13, and they're just coming off a 56-6 win over UCLA, who beat, credit, they were in LA for that game. UCLA beat Maryland 20-17. So transitive property says home field advantage 3 points. Changing home venues that rapidly is 6. Transitive property says that Indiana should win this game by 47 points, but that's lazy analysis. We're not going to do that here. Indiana, in theory, by odds, should win out and play Ohio State, and if not Ohio State, either Oregon or Michigan, maybe USC or even Iowa in the Big Ten Championship game. But likely, it's going to be Indiana against Ohio State in the Big Ten Championship game. The odds overwhelmingly say that. Need to keep going pedal to the metal, though, to improve your standings, to get to a point where you can work in your depth in the fourth quarters Indiana's been doing. A win over Maryland on the road would be big, especially given the context that Maryland played Indiana a little close last year due to forcing plenty of turnovers. For the Terrapins, started off hot, 4-0, impressive win on the road at the time against Wisconsin, very dominant, but they choked to Washington with a 20-0 lead. They led Nebraska at one point by, I believe, double digits, or at least by a score. They choked that, lost 34-31, and they lost to UCLA on the road 20-17. 4 wins, followed by 3 close losses in Big Ten play, and they got a bye before this game. So you know that Mike Loxley and his staff have been working hard for this game, because this can change the trajectory in the season for Maryland with a win here. This is their biggest test by a mile yet. Unfortunately, the fan base probably isn't as engaged as they used to be because of the 2 straight home losses and then the loss to UCLA. But your bowl hopes are alive, and with Rutgers and Illinois on the road, Michigan at home, Michigan State on the road, in a game at Ford Field that will tilt towards MSU, you need to collect the wins now. Otherwise, you very realistically could lose out, go 4-8, and then Loxley may not be here next year. Same with the talented true freshmen on offense and on defense. Indiana is, look, they're 6th in points per play. They're 6th in points per play allowed. Maryland's 9th in points per play allowed, but 67th in points per play offensively. Indiana's played the tougher schedule here. They have the better players, the better staff. Watch out for the Hoosiers. Quarterback Fernando Mendoza. If this game does get ugly, his brother Alberto Mendoza, who isn't as good as he is, but has shown promise. And then running backs Roman Hemby, Kalon Black. Receivers E.J. Williams, Elijah Surratt, Omar Cooper Jr. Their offensive line, Pat Coogan, Bray Lynch, Drew Evans, Khalil Benson, and Carter Smith. I think this is the best offense in the country from what I can see right now. Best defense, I have to give that to Ohio State. The number 1 and number 2 team, they have the number 1 offense and number 1 defense, and then Ohio State's offense is certainly top 10, if not top 5. Indiana's defense is certainly top 5. So you have the 2 best teams in the country right now in the Big Ten. Maryland's playing one of them. And on defense, we'll see if Aiden Fisher plays, but Isaiah Jones and Elijah Hardy should be able to do cleanup duty. And you have Tyreek Tucker, Michael Kamara, Stephen Daly, Mario Landino, and then Jamari Sharp, Devin Boykin, Amari Farrell, Lewis Moore, and D'Angelo Pons. That's the Indiana defense. Yes, I know that team that well. They're playing against a Maryland roster who has Malik Washington, Nolan Ray. They have some good players on offense, but mostly for Maryland, it is their defense you have to pay attention to. So Sidney Stewart and Zahir Mathis are among some of the better true freshmen in America. And then they also have Nasheer Taylor in that rotation on the defensive end. He has a sack on the year. We have a lot of wonderful true freshman pass rushers. And then Cam Rice, Dylan Fontes, done a good job on the D-line. This D-line for Maryland, they lost a ton from last year, and yet I think they may have upgraded there. And Daniel Wingate's been a phenomenal linebacker. Jalen Husky at free safety is a great player. This defense is going to be a unique test for Indiana. I do think Oregon and Iowa have better defenses, but if you're Indiana, you do want to win by as much as possible. You want to continue to get better. If you have improved throughout the year, you should perform at a high level even against a defense of this caliber for Maryland. I will come out and say that I do think this Maryland defense is a bit of a paper tiger here. I will say that. Washington, they played after the Ohio State game where Washington had to travel a ways. Nebraska's offense has shown us through multiple games that it's still broken and probably needs another year under Dana Holgorsen to really unlock Raiola and that whole system. Their non-conference opponents were bad. Wisconsin has no offense, and UCLA's UCLA. Like they were kind of a gimmick that was cute and impressive for a while, but Indiana showed who they really were. Indiana's better everywhere. You know, their pass offense, their rush offense, their pass defense, their rush defense should kill Maryland, and their overall team and staff is better. So I am going to go with Indiana to win and cover. I think they'll pretty convincingly beat Maryland here. It'll get ugly. I think by the second quarter, there's a real chance Indiana's already covered by halftime in the same way they did against UCLA. That Michigan State game is keeping Indiana honest enough in Cignetti's mind, and they didn't play all that well offensively against UCLA. So I'd expect them to play better offensively, at least relative to their expectations against Maryland. They may not play better statistically because Maryland's defense is way better than UCLA's, but irrespective of competition, factoring in the different opponents they're playing, I think Indiana will play better on offense this week than they did last week. If Aiden Fisher plays in this game, with how Maryland's offense at times has looked, there's a really good chance that Maryland could get shut out by Indiana here. Wouldn't predict it, because if they couldn't shut out UCLA, are they really going to shut out Maryland? But they could. That's how good Indiana is. And with a win here, and probably wins over Penn State, Wisconsin, and Purdue, you'd expect them to go to Indy, and whether it's 90+% chance Ohio State, but also there's a chance that Oregon, Iowa, Michigan, even USC are there. You'd expect them to compete in that game, maybe win, and they'll make a run in the playoffs. Indiana is the only team right now that has better odds to go to the playoffs than Ohio State. Both are locks, by the way, but the only reason they have a better chance is because their chance at going undefeated is actually the only team that has a higher chance than Ohio State right now, because Ohio State has to play both Penn State at home and Michigan on the road. Michigan on the road would be the toughest opponent out of both Ohio State and Indiana's remaining schedules by quite a bit. So that's why. Hoosiers should win big here. Really love the direction of this program and of this team. One of the best staffs, one of the best teams in America, and right now the best coaching job in America resides in Bloomington, Indiana. Coaching job is in how they've done with their team, how they've planned, how they've schemed, how they've developed, not in terms of this is a better job than LSU, for example. All right, let's talk about Oklahoma at Tennessee. Before then, I just need to reply to a text. The 18th ranked Oklahoma Sooners travel to the 14th ranked Tennessee Volunteers. Both earned bowl eligibility within the past 2 weeks. Oklahoma 2 weeks ago against South Carolina. Tennessee against Kentucky, where they won in quite the shootout 2 days ago, this past Saturday. These teams will be fighting for their playoff hopes remaining alive in this matchup. Tennessee's favored by 3.5 points. This will be a 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time game on ABC, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Two scrappy quarterbacks that aren't perfect, but that help their teams out. Two defenses that are coming off of questionable performances, and two coaches that are respected in the college football world, but want to break their programs into that national title contender category. So let's get after it and talk about Oklahoma first. Oklahoma started off red hot, beating Illinois State. Michigan, they won by 11. Beat Temple on the road. Auburn, they won in a close game at home. Crushed Kent State with the backup QB. Lost to Texas pretty convincingly. Beat South Carolina pretty convincingly. And then, even though their loss to Ole Miss was only by 8, that was a pretty convincing loss, I would say. This Tennessee game, along with, after a bye, a trip to Alabama, will be tough, to say the least. That's a tough back-to-back road game stretch. Luckily, the bye is sandwiched in between those two. And then even without their starting quarterback and even backup, Missouri will be a test. LSU at the end of the year, if they play inspired, could be a test. Will they beat Tennessee? They have to. If they want to reach the playoffs, barring an upset win over Alabama and winning out after Tennessee, they'll have to win here. Their trip to Atlanta at this point with the 2 conference losses is likely dead. It's the same thing with Tennessee here. Beat Syracuse, hung a lot of points on them, hung a lot of points on East Tennessee State. They've hung a lot of points on every team they've played, minus maybe Alabama. And even though they put on a lot of yards, they just had a lot of empty calories there, including that painful pick 6. They're coming off a 56-34 win over Kentucky. You don't see scores like that usually in the post-2023 clock change, of the clock rules change, but you do see it with the Tennessee Volunteers. I wonder in this matchup whether or not some of the concerns with both of these secondaries will be exposed. That's kind of what I'm thinking here. Both have really good players in the secondary, but they're also gettable defensively. You saw that with Tennessee against Georgia and Alabama. You did see it with Oklahoma against Texas and Ole Miss. These teams are more equal than in any other prior matchup. So Georgia and Alabama are definitively better than Tennessee. Oklahoma is a little bit worse than Tennessee, according to FPI. Oklahoma's definitively worse in most power ratings outside of S&P Plus than Texas, or at least similar. And they are now worse than Ole Miss almost across the board in power ratings. So let's look at, some of the matchups here and the key players. Oklahoma's defense is still top 5 even after that performance against Ole Miss in points allowed per play. They're 4th. Tennessee is 4th in points per play, but they're 82nd in points allowed per play. For the Sooners, John Mateer, Isaiah Satenya, Jaron Kanak, Dion Burks. Can they get behind this Tennessee backfield? And can they score? Can they convert on reliable downs? Because Tennessee defensively, Dominic Bailey, Joshua Josephs, their D-line is their strength on defense. And they also got a future NFL player in Colton Hood back there at corner. That is their strength defensively, is the run defense for Tennessee. And it's the weakness of Oklahoma's offense. They cannot help themselves in terms of running the football. Oklahoma's strength is also on the defensive front. And while Tennessee does have some strength in running the ball, they're better at it certainly than Oklahoma is. Their strength is with Braylon Staley, Chris Brazzell II, and quarterback Joey Aguilar being the gunslinger that he is. So those are the players to pay attention to there. I, in the preseason, loved Oklahoma in this spot and continuously went back and forth between it, especially after Nico left. I loved Oklahoma in this spot, but that 3.5 point line is indicative of the right team being favored and of the books being confident that Tennessee will win, even if it is in a close game. And I do think Tennessee has favorable matchups here. I think that Oklahoma's pass offense will win more battles than not against Tennessee's passing defense. But I also believe that Tennessee will stop the run enough to force Mateer to play Superman. So even though Oklahoma will win against the Tennessee passing defense more than Tennessee's passing defense will win against Oklahoma's pass offense, Oklahoma will probably have a turnover here or two, or some missed passes, and while they should be able to move the ball against this Tennessee defense, Tennessee will control the tempo based on how this Oklahoma offense functions. So I like Tennessee's rush offense to do enough, just enough to keep this Oklahoma defense honest, and here and there they'll rip them through the air. The overall teams are pretty equal. The overall staffs are equal. This is one of the more even matches that I've seen in a while this year. And with that, I want to go with the home team. I do think that Tennessee here, they will win. They will cover in this night game. It being a home game at night will also help the Volunteers' case, especially after a back-to-back road games. This is a must-win spot for both these teams, especially for Tennessee because their strength of schedule is weaker if they want to get in the college football playoff. So Oklahoma, love them as a team. Don't think they're great, just think they're good. It's similar with Tennessee. Home field tells me to give the nod to the Volunteers. Both of these teams right now have 2 losses. Tennessee's 7th in conference play. Oklahoma is tied with Florida and Missouri at 8th. Neither is going to get to Atlanta. That's Texas on up are the contenders to get to Atlanta, though maybe if something really crazy happens, one of them could find their way, but that would require them winning out. Not likely for OU, and Tennessee's strength of schedule is weak enough to where someone would probably get in over them with tiebreakers for a trip to Atlanta. But at this point, they're fighting for a playoff berth, more importantly than a conference championship game appearance or title, which that'll go to Texas A&M or Alabama, most likely, or someone who only has one conference loss. Tennessee will win. They will cover the 3.5 point spread. I expect them to win this game by 7, and maybe they'll win by double digits because I think Heupel, much like last year, will want to run up the score here and make a statement. And last but not least, USC traveling to Nebraska. The newly 23rd ranked USC Trojans who re-entered the AP poll this week travel to the unranked but bowl eligible Nebraska Cornhuskers. Both teams have 2 losses. USC has lost to Illinois and Notre Dame. Nebraska, they have lost to Minnesota and Michigan. Nebraska 6-2, USC 5-2. The Trojans have to make a trip, grueling trip, out to Lincoln after making a trip out to South Bend, but they had a bye sandwich in between those 2 games to rest and prepare for what is a big game, essentially a college football playoff elimination game. The Trojans are favored by 6.5 points here. This will be 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time on NBC. The Trojans, I believe that when healthy, they are a top 10 team, and I want to continue to say that and put it out there. If I'm wrong, then I'm wrong. But Illinois, that loss was not all that bad when you consider that they weren't healthy and they were traveling on the road. And that was a must-win bounce-back spot for Illinois that tested their character. Illinois passed the character test. USC nearly won. They had chances to win. Now, if some questionable calls went the other way, I think that Illinois may have dominated. But who USC is, I think, has more to do with what they showed against Notre Dame, Michigan, Michigan State, and Purdue than what they showed against Illinois. And that is a top 10 quality team when they want to be, when they're playing their starters, when they aren't looking ahead. That is who USC is. I picked them to go to the playoffs in the preseason. Right now, with the unexpected loss to Illinois and then losing to Notre Dame, I don't know if I'd pick them to go that far. They'd have to win out. They'd have to beat Nebraska this Saturday, then beat Northwestern Friday, beat Iowa Saturday, beat Oregon on the road, and beat rival UCLA. And that is a tough November stretch. There's no bye mixed in there. And 2 tough road games with, hundreds to thousands of miles of traveling, and 2 opponents that for Oregon, they're top 5 rated, and Nebraska's top 30 rated. These teams played last year. USC won 28-20, and that was with them surrendering a pick 6. Maeva has improved. Sear Wright has improved. They're going to want this game badly for a variety of different reasons. Nebraska's going to want this game badly. USC will. And that's what makes this game so entertaining. And a loss will be apoplectic to either of these fan bases because they will know that they will not reach the playoff with a loss here. And that will be hurtful to a USC fan base that at one point thought they were going to go to the playoffs this year and that really wants Riley to break through in that way. It'd be painful for a Matt Rule-led Cornhusker squad and fan base that said openly in the preseason, we embrace people picking us to go to the playoffs. That is our expectation to reach there. Someone's going to be heartbroken here, and someone is going to be elated from a win. We'll see. USC, though, 6.5 point favorites, and when you look at their schedule in juxtaposition to Nebraska's, you can see why they're the favorites even traveling on the road. Nebraska's best win of the year is a 20-17 point win over Cincinnati. Outside of that, they blew out Akron and Houston Christian, but against power competition, they've either won close games exclusively. Maryland, Northwestern, Cincinnati were close wins. Michigan was a close loss. Michigan State at one point that the Spartans were winning, and then Nebraska just bullied them in the fourth quarter, and Minnesota bullied Nebraska in that second half. This is a good team, maybe above average, at worst average. They're not bad, but they're not a team that is a college football playoff team from the perspective of power ratings. From a schedule standpoint, if they win out, especially with how good Iowa's looked and with USC being ranked here in their power rating, Nebraska could be like Georgia Tech, where you're a fringe top 25 power rated team, but because you've taken care of your schedule for the most part, you could be invited to the playoffs. That's Nebraska's best case scenario at this point. And USC or Iowa, both games at home, will probably be their toughest tasks in terms of quality of team, power ratings, and the coaching staffs they're playing against. Must win for Nebraska here if they want to go to the playoffs. And also, if they want to keep momentum alive. They got to win over Northwestern in a game that Northwestern could have easily won. You don't want to go 6-6 again. You don't even want to go 7-5. You want to go 8-4 or even 9-3. And if you get to 10-2, that's gravy. If you lose here, I have a hard time seeing 9-3 let alone 8-4. Lose here on 7-5, I think, is pretty likely, given some of the matchups and other things I've seen, like some of Penn State's talent, how Nebraska struggled in the trenches, and Penn State at least is competent there, and also how Iowa has looked. A loss here would put you at 8-4 or 7-5, I think. A win here, and you're looking at 9-3, 10-2. I'm pretty sure. So big swing game for the Cornhuskers. And that is where I begin to get speechless, because this is a tough game. So I have two reads here, and I want to dive into them with future content on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. I might even do a video per day on this game. Won't promise that, but I might. There are two angles to this game. This game reminds me a ton of a former Pac-12 team traveling out east to play a blue blood in a night game rowdy environment. This reminds me of Oregon traveling to Penn State, with the hindsight added, because in that game I was all on Penn State, was totally wrong here. This game reminds me of that game with hindsight, where I think USC is the better team here. And I think much like how the analytics thought Oregon was better, and I didn't obey them enough, though that was understandable because of, sometimes teams are slow against bad opponents, as Georgia's been in the past, or even Michigan, and they turn it up. Penn State just wasn't that team. But regardless, analytics say USC's better. I believe they're the better team here. I think that it's understandable they are favored. However, that can go one of two ways. Nebraska steals one in the way that Penn State nearly did. USC plays a close game and wins a close game. Or USC can go in here and burn Nebraska's house down. I don't think that Nebraska in any way, shape, or form is going to win in a blowout. Maybe they control the game or even dominate in the feeling, but it won't be reflected on the scoreboard. USC is too explosive and too good in the trenches relative to where Nebraska is for them to be dominated. They are the dominant player here. It just depends on how they use their cards, how Nebraska plays their cards, and whether or not the travel or the stadium or the will of Nebraska powers them forward. Because I will say, Nebraska has more momentum entering this game than USC does. And Nebraska is probably going to be the more emotional team. And that can play in a positive way. It can play in a negative way. Those are the outcomes I'm looking at, where USC is the better team. It reminds me a lot situationally of Oregon going to Penn State. It's not going to be as critical for Matt Rule's future as that game was for James Franklin's future, but it is critical, I think, in a lot of ways for Matt Rule's future. And USC is the better team. It just depends on whether or not Nebraska wins in a close one, or USC controls or dominates much of the game, and regardless of whether they win it close because Nebraska attempts a comeback or USC pulls away, it's the same thing for Nebraska. You're eliminated from the playoffs. The result is effectively going to be the same. You'll either win and be happy with it, or you'll lose and be sad. That goes for both of these fan bases. So let's take a look at the matchups here. For Nebraska, the key players are going to be Emmett Johnson, Isaiah Hunter at wide receiver, and Dylan Raiola. The offensive line improved at pass blocking against Northwestern. We'll see if they can do that against a better USC defense and defensive front that is more talented. I would also pay attention to, for the Cornhuskers, their defensive line. Can they hold their own long enough against this USC offensive line and rushing attack? USC's rushing attack has been mediocre on the road. It's been excellent at home, but it's been very mediocre at home. Deshaun Singleton, Sear Wright, and Andrew Marshall, they are going to have to play a phenomenal game for Nebraska to win. Because, given the defensive line and how it's played, they will likely have to make some tackles and come down and help in run defense, while also making sure they don't get cooked by Mekhi Lemon, Jacoby Lane, Walker Lyons, or Lake McCree, the two best wide receivers and two best tight ends that USC will use along with Jaden Maiava. And for USC's defense, Eric Gentry, Kamari Ramsey, and Bishop Fitzgerald, kind of the backfield defenders, typically inside the tackle box or just around it for the Trojans, the safeties and linebackers. They're going to have to assist in run defense, cleaning up against a shifty Emmett Johnson. And Raiola has a cannon of an arm. Hunter's made some amazing catches, run some great routes. Dane Key and Ja'Cory Barney are also reliable. They are going to have to help a corner room that struggled, and they're going to have to prevent big plays. Both of these teams want this game. They've both had struggles. USC enters with statistically the number one offense in the country. In actuality, I'd give that to Indiana. I think when you factor in what teams want to do versus what they have to do offensively, I think Indiana's is better than USC's, along with a handful of other offenses. But it's a top 10 offense, a defense that's average. Nebraska's defense is also average. Their offense is just above average. Again, USC is playing as the better team here. I do like both of these pass offenses against the pass defenses, especially Nebraska's pass offense against USC's defense, especially. USC has struggled at times to get pressure, especially on the road. This is a much different team on the road than at home. And the corners have been lackluster for the Trojans. But for USC, we've seen Nebraska's secondary not really against Michigan or Cincinnati, but as the season's gone on, Preston Stone was able to make some throws, and Northwestern's receivers were able to get open enough to where it's a good secondary, but it's not elite as the early metrics and early returns suggested. We also saw them struggle at times against Minnesota and against Maryland, and not really Michigan State, but that was a weather game. USC is the best pass offense by a mile that Nebraska's played all year. I think they, at times, will have their way. The Trojans will through the air. Their rush offense, especially if O'Connor will start at center, and if he's recovered from his injury that he suffered against, was either Michigan State or Illinois. I think it was Illinois. Yeah, it was Illinois. Especially if that's the case, they will be able to run the ball against this Nebraska run defense. This is a huge John Butler game. Him, first-year DC since 2013 with Penn State. An NFL guy with the secondary defense that struggled at times this year against one of the best offensive minds in football. This is a John Butler game. It's also a D'Anton Lynn game. I think USC's run defense will do just enough because I believe their D-line should be able to eat up Nebraska's O-line in enough plays to keep them off schedule. But Johnson is shifty, and I would expect Nebraska to pull out all the cards necessary to win here. So USC will do enough on D-line versus Nebraska's O-line to force some pressures and to slow down the run. But I wouldn't be shocked if Nebraska has one of their better rushing performances of the entire season in this game. Again, USC when healthy is a top 10 team. But when they have to rotate and when they have to play for a full 4 quarters and maybe suffer some injuries here and there, that begins to rapidly fluctuate. I would argue that Nebraska's backups probably do a better job filling in for their starters than USC's backups do. USC is one of the most bipolar teams when it comes to their starting lineup, and they're too deep. One of the furthest distances between those two in the sport. USC is the better overall team. I do think to this point USC is the better overall staff, but it's not by this vast margin. I will come out and say that I think that the key matchup here is ultimately going to be whether or not Nebraska can run the ball on USC. If they can, then maybe what I said earlier about Nebraska not being able to make it ugly for USC isn't true, and Nebraska can earn a huge win here. If they can't run the ball against USC, I don't see how Raiola, with that O-line and with some of his inconsistencies, is just going to shred this USC secondary enough for Nebraska to win. That's the key here. That's the key matchup. The secondary one is John Butler and his play calls against Lincoln Riley and his play calls. Not even the personnel. Not even the personnel there. Just the play calling between those two. Because I'm not an expert on play calling, I have no idea how that one will go. Would favor Riley there. And with all that being said, and all the different matchups and the quality of team, I do think USC wins. I believe Nebraska covers, though. Much like in the spirit of Oregon Penn State, where Oregon won by 6 in overtime, or they were, in all likelihood, if you play the game over again with the same staff, Penn State probably starts off hotter on offense, and it's it's a close game. It was a close game. I believe Nebraska will put out an effort, and it will be their second close loss of the season to bring their close game record to 3-2. I wouldn't be shocked if any team wins here. I'm going with USC because I think they're better, and the bye is critically timed. If this was a back-to-back road game stretch, and the Notre Dame game was last Saturday, so just 2 days ago, and you had to have that back-to-back travel, then I would pick Nebraska here. But that bye is so well-timed. It's so well-timed. That is a big swing here to help USC get healthy, to help them rebound and recover. And USC, trench play is one of the things they're not perfect at. The fact they're playing against a Nebraska team where they're weak in the trenches really stands to benefit the Trojans. So Nebraska will cover, but USC will win, probably by a field goal or something. Looking at the Big Ten standings here, Nebraska's outside shot to get to the playoffs would be killed with a loss here. Same with USC. This is a must-needed win for a playoff appearance. If Nebraska wins this game, their odds of going to the playoffs, I would say, are high. If USC wins, they're still pretty low because you got Oregon left on the schedule. Iowa is probably a better team than Nebraska, although they'll have to travel to the Coliseum to play that game after a home game against Oregon. So that'd be a tough back-to-back stretch for the Hawkeyes. But these teams are alive for the playoffs, and this is what college football is all about, is you have goals, and in November, the achievers and the losers are decided. So this game will be one of those matchups that decides who goes home sad and who goes home that is able to survive in advance. And that is it for this stream, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. These clips will be out within the next 2 hours, and then after that, at this point, I'd say probably not at 6 p.m. If we can, we will go live at 6 p.m., but maybe at 8 p.m. We'll try and go live for the second stream of the day to give you more previews and also some thoughts on the job openings in college football. Thank you so much for watching.